In this video we're going to create more pipe connections, and this time we're going to connect pipes that have different diameters. So we're going to do something like this. And sometimes I use a free plugin to create connections like this, and that plugin is called Cylinder to Cylinder 2. It's by Jürgen Meyer. And a while ago I made an in-depth tutorial on how to use this plugin, and you can go and check out my profile and watch those videos if you want to. And don't be put off by the fact that those videos were recorded back in release 9. Everything about this plugin still works exactly the same way as it did back in release 9. In this video, however, we're not going to use any plugins. So let's get started. First of all, we need a cylinder, and I'm going to change the orientation to +X. And like in the previous videos on creating pipe connections, we're going to use subdivision surfaces. So I don't want 36 rotation segments. But if you've watched those videos, you already know that I will go for a higher poly version, simply because I want to make sure that we get a smooth and clean looking transition. So in this case I'm going for 28 rotation segments, and the cylinder is going to be our big pipe. I want a smaller pipe coming out of that big pipe, and for modeling that smaller pipe I'm going to start with a disk object, and I'll change the orientation of this disk to -Z, and I'll move it in front of the big pipe here. Now we don't need any disk segments for this object, and as for the radius, I want the smaller pipe to be 30 centimeters. Next we need to find out how many rotation segments we need for that disk. We need to make sure that we can connect the geometry of the disk and the big pipe properly. So in this case we can't really use 36 rotation segments. What will work here is either 14 segments, and you can see with 14 segments we're not getting a perfect match, but we're close enough to be able to make this work. So you can see we have corresponding geometry here on the side of this disk object, and what we have to do anyway is create new geometry on the big pipe to be able to connect the top of this geometry properly. But we can go a little higher for the rotation segments. So here we can use 16 segments, and you can see with 16 segments the geometry matches up pretty nicely here. So that is something we can use, and I'm going to call this small pipe. Next, what I want to do is I want to create some geometry that will be a transition between the big pipe and the small pipe. And there's two ways we can do that. First of all, we have to make this small pipe editable. One thing we can do is, in polygon mode, we could select all of the polygons and then use Extrude Inner to create a polygon loop like this that we can use as a transition. But the problem is that we're changing the original radius of that small pipe, and I want to keep this at 30 centimeters. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to select the outer edges of this disk object, and I'm going to extrude those edges. I'm going to do this in the front view. So let's go ahead and use extrude, and I'm going to extrude these so the tip up here is close to this edge on the big pipe. It doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to have to change a few things anyway, but I just want to get it fairly close. So this will work nicely. We don't need these polygons here on the inside, so we could just select these edges and delete them. And as you can see, extruding those edges has caused another problem, because now the geometry is not lining up as it should. But we can change that by moving some points on this small pipe and snap those points to the edges of the big pipe here. So let's go ahead and do that. We need to switch on snapping, and in this case we need to make sure we have edge snap selected here. And now we can move these points and snap them to the edges of the cylinder. We won't have to change the position of these points here at the center, so we can ignore these. But we have to line up the points down here. And in order to make this polygon loop a little more even again, I'm going to select some of the points and I'm going to scale these. So let's switch off snapping here, and I'll select these points here and scale them out just a little bit. You can also select these points here and scale those. And the points at the tip, we can also scale them down a bit along the y-axis. Maybe let's just scale these in a bit more again. So something like this. It doesn't have to be perfect. Now we can see the geometry lines up very nicely again, but we do need additional geometry on our big pipe, because some of the edges here on the small pipe, they need to be continued on the big pipe. So let's go ahead and create some geometry on the big pipe. Now for this big pipe I don't really need any caps, so I'm just going to delete those or switch them off. We could add some height segments here. So by adding one height segment, we're getting this edge loop at the center, which will connect nicely to the center of the small pipe. And because we're not using any caps, I want to create a couple more height segments, because later on we'll have to delete some of the polygons here, and when we connect both of these objects, it'll be a little more difficult to recreate the geometry to complete that big cylinder again. So I'm going to add some more height segments here. I'm going for 4. So now we can delete the polygons in between these edge loops here, connect both objects, and then it'll be much easier to close those polygon holes. But of course we still need some more geometry before we can connect these two objects, because we still have these two edges here that need to be continued on the big pipe. So let's make this big pipe editable, and I'm going to use the knife tool in plane mode, and just in case I'm going to switch off restrict to selection, and we have to change the plane to YZ. And in order to make these cuts, I'm going to switch on snapping again, because I want to snap to points, and now I can create these two additional edge loops here. So the next question is, how do we get this geometry of the small pipe onto the big pipe? And we can do that pretty easily by projecting the geometry of the small pipe onto the big pipe. And there's two things we have to bear in mind when we do that. First of all, this object here has to be in front of the pipe. And second, we have to do this in the front view, and we have to select the small pipe, and then we can go to Character, Commands, and you can find an option that is called Project Object down here. And if you click on the cogwheel, you can open up a window with some options. We're going to use the default here, which is Points to Surface. So we can just hit OK. And you can see nothing change here in the front view. But if we switch back to the perspective view, you can see that now the geometry has been projected nicely onto the surface of our big pipe here. So now we can select the big pipe, go to polygon mode and use the live selection tool, and we're going to delete all the polygons on the big pipe where the small pipe is going to be. So all of these ones. And deleting polygons means that we have some points left, because the points that connected those polygons, they're not deleted along with the polygon, so we have to optimize this object. And whenever you want to optimize an entire object, you have to make sure that you either have everything selected or everything deselected. Because if I select a couple of points here and optimize the object, Cinema 4D will only optimize the selected points. Alternatively, you could go to model mode and optimize the object, and in this case it doesn't really matter if you have any points, edges or polygons selected. In this case I'm going to run the optimize command in point view, just so you can see a little better what's going on. So up here in the heads up display you can see that we have 196 points right now, and I've deselected all of the points, and now I can right click and click on optimize. We can use the default settings here, and now we only have 175 points left. So now we can select both of these objects, right click and select connect objects and delete. And next we have to close this polygon hole. However, because there's no real connection between this transition here and the geometry of the big pipe, that will not work very well, as you will see in a second. So if we right click and select close polygon hole and close that hole here, Cinema 4D doesn't really know what to do. So we have to make some changes to make this work. And all we need to do really is go to edge mode and use the bridge tool to close some of the geometry here. So I'm just going to bridge these two edges up here and these two edges down here. And this should be enough for close polygon hole to work. So let's try that. You can see this time closing those polygon holes work perfectly fine. Now let's select these two Ngons we've just created, and we can right click and remove those Ngons. This option is at the very bottom of this menu here. So if I tear this off and drag this up a little, maybe you can see it down here, remove Ngons. The problem is, depending on the geometry you have, this will not work very well, and you can see the geometry that has been created here, we can't really use that for subdivision surfaces. So let's undo that. And again, we can help Cinema 4D to do a better job by just making a few adjustments here. So in point mode, I'm going to select these 2 points here, and I'm going to use connect points edges to create an edge between these 2 points. And I'll do that over here and down here. And now if we go back to polygon mode and use remove Ngons again, you can see that Cinema 4D has created a clean geometry that we can use. So everything's looking fine. Let's go ahead and add a subdivision surface object to see how this transition looks. It seems to be pretty clean. Let's do a render from the right view here. Well, you probably can't really see that, so let me add a background object here. If I zoom in very close, you can see this transition is almost perfect. We're only getting a tiny bit of deformation here, so that's pretty much perfect. So now we can go ahead and extrude that small pipe. Let's go to edge mode, and I'm using the move tool, and you can double click on any of these edges here to select the entire edge loop. Now we can hold down the control key, left click and drag on the z-axis to extrude these edges out a bit, maybe something like this. So these will be our control edges to hold the shape when we use subdivision surfaces. And let's go ahead and extrude these out one more time. Then I can scale these edges down and hold down the shift key to scale in increments, and we're going to scale these down to 0. Let's add another subdivision surface object. You can see we're getting a very nice looking connection here between that big pipe and that small pipe. So we're basically finished, but I want to do a variation of this small pipe where I have another one of these small pipes coming out of the top of this big pipe here, and we can do that simply by copying the geometry we already have. So I'm going to make a copy of this pipe connection 1, and what we'll do is, in polygon mode, we can select these polygons here. So we need to select all of the polygons where this small pipe is, and then we can right click and split those polygons off, and this will create a new object here. Let's go to model mode. Now before we can rotate this, we have to move the object axis. So I'm going to enable axis, and then I can just reset the position of this axis to 0 in the z-axis. Switch off enable axis again, and now we can rotate this geometry, hold down the shift key and rotate it by -90 degrees to put it on top of that big pipe here. And of course we have to delete some geometry on the original object to be able to connect both of these. So in polygon mode, I'm going to use my loop selection tool to select these polygon loops here. And let's just delete those. And we also have to delete these two polygons here where the transition is. And because we've deleted all those polygons, we have a ton of points that we don't need anymore. So let's deselect everything and optimize this object. And now we can select both of these, right click and select connect objects and delete. Deselect all the points again and optimize the object. And in edge mode, I'm going to use the bridge tool to close these holes here. Okay, and maybe in point mode I could use the slide tool. Slide this point up a bit, and maybe slide this point up a bit, and slide this one up a bit more. Something like this. And let's see how that looks if we subdivide it. And you can see we're getting a pretty nice looking variation of our original connection here. So now all that's left to do is to create some thickness for both of these pipes. So this will be pipe connection 2, and I'll just make a copy of both of these, and we'll call this one example 1, and the other one will be example 2. Let's switch off example 2, switch on example 1. I'm going to make another copy of this one, and it looks like we have to reposition the object axis for these two objects here. So same as before, enable the axis and put the object axis to 0 in the z-axis here. Now we can select one of these objects and just scale it down a bit. And in the top view I'm going to select these edges here, switch on snapping, and I'm going to line these edges up with the edges of the bigger object here. And in order to be able to connect the geometry properly, we have to go to polygon mode, select all of the polygons of the smaller object, and right click and reverse the normals. And then we can select both of these objects, right click, connect objects, and delete. Let's go to edge mode, and I'm going to select all of these edges here, and we can use stitch and sew to close these holes. And we have to hold down the shift key and left click and drag from any point down here or up here to a corresponding point, like so. And with all of these edge loops still selected, we can right click and go to our bevel tool, and let's use a solid bevel. Let's use a radius or an offset of 2 centimeters here and apply. And let's see how that looks when we subdivide the object. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. So this is example 1. And for the second example, I'm not going to create the entire inside, I'm just going to close those polygon holes and extrude some geometry to create the illusion of thickness. So let's use close polygon hole to create the caps here. Let's start with those big Ngons here. I'm going to use extrude inner. Let's do an offset of maybe 9 or 10, something like this. And I'm going to extrude these Ngons down to maybe about here. And we can delete these now. And it looks like I didn't close this hole up here. Now we can select these two Ngons here, and again use extrude inner. Let's do something like 6 centimeters, and extrude those Ngons back a bit to maybe about here, and delete them. And in edge mode, let's use the loop selection tool to select all of these edge loops here, because we need to create additional edges that will be the control edges to hold the shape of this object. And again, let's use the bevel tool with the same settings as before. Let's hit apply. Let's add a subdivision surface object. And I'm just going to move this over a bit. And let's do a final render. So that's the end of this tutorial. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you again soon.